for sponsoring me and also for nominating me to this visiting fellowship. And thank you, Professor Dean Yang, and the entire leadership of the faculty for being here. I'm absolutely delighted, honored to be back in Hong Kong, to be back in Hong Kong University, and to be back again in the faculty. I have visited the faculty on many occasions, and this is absolutely the best time on this occasion to hold this distinguished visiting fellowship. Of course, I have to acknowledge the contribution and the generosity of the charitable foundation that supports this particular visiting fellowship. I am particularly inspired and impressed by the commitment of the foundation to creating and creative minds with humanistic sensibilities to chart a cosmopolitan and multicultural future, which is very much the theme and concern of today's talk, especially in this day and age of dynamic changes. Dean Yang mentioned the historical changes to the faculty, and that's very much the context from which I want to start this talk. So your faculty developed from a department for the training of teachers in the Faculty of Arts in Hong Kong University in 1917, if my history is correct, and then became the School of Education in 1976. And of course, became formally a faculty of the university 40 years ago that you are celebrating the anniversary right now. Similarly, my current institution, the UCL Institute of Education, started off as a London day training college for teachers of the University of London and run by the University of London and London County Council in 1902. And then became University London's Institute of Education in 1932, and merged with UCL to become a Faculty of Education society called UCL Institute of Education in 2014. We're less than 10 years old as a faculty within the UCL community. The reason I'm mentioning these things is because our roles, our relationships, and our responsibilities change historically. But I guess what I'm really concerned with today is in this day and age, it is not just the changes over time that we're concerned with and different identities and roles and positions we have to have, but simultaneously the multiple roles and identities and positions we all have. So for example, speaking personally, I'm here as an academic visitor. I am also talking and meeting colleagues here, and as an advisor on a number of things. I have been Kevin's supervisor, but I am also supervising a number of students who are currently in Hong Kong. I'm a reviewer for some of your research output, have been an examiner and am examiner for a number of programs and theses. I am a speaker here and I'm speaking at a number of events in Hong Kong as well. I'm also a colleague, I hope, of many of you and a friend of many of the colleagues here. So I have these different roles simultaneously. Now, we won't have time to ask each and every one of you how many different roles you have had so far today, but I'm sure all of you can name a number of roles, not just a single role, single identity, or single position. And that is very much the characteristic of today's world and all of us. Simultaneously, we have multiplex relationships, roles, and responsibilities, multiple and complex. And that is the feature of today's world that is really characterized by Zygmunt Bauman as liquid modernity. The liquidity is really important and something that I'm working on with my dear friend and colleague T.K. Li, a professor of English linguistics here at Hong Kong U. And our fairly recent article has caused a great deal of attention, and it's aimed to develop a new approach to identity and identity positioning. And the work is very much inspired by Bauman's book, which was written almost 25 years ago, called Liquid Modernity, where he was talking about a kind of chaotic continuation of modernity, where a person can shift one's social position to another in a fluid manner. And this liquid modernity or liquid modern person flows through their own life like a tourist, changing places, jobs, spouses, values, sometimes more, such as political or sexual orientation, excluding themselves for traditional networks of support, while also freeing themselves from the restrictions and requirements of these networks really impose. So previously, when I was a variationist sociolinguist in the very classical kind of way, I worked on the social network model of linguistic variation and change, and social networks were very much seen as a norm enforcement mechanism. And of course, that still is true. But what is happening to the late modern or liquid modern 21st century social life is we try to free ourselves from these conventional networks. We want to contract and build multiple networks, multiple but also complex, dynamic, always changing networks with the rest of the world, and simultaneously have to manage these different networks. So the norms and pressures and expectations are quite different. So we have new burden of responsibility that fluid modernism places on the individual, and traditional patterns will be replaced by self-identification and self-chosen ones. I won't go into all of that. Of course, different people have different capacities and different funds because of their developmental trajectories, but the result is the emphasis is very much on shifting and on changing rather than staying. And that is something that really is very typical of the modern world. Now, when liquid modernity gets together with what we call posthumanism in the critical cultural theories, it becomes even more complex, dynamic, and interesting. In critical theory, the post-human is a speculative being that represents and seeks to reconceive the human. So in contrast to humanism, where human nature is a universal state, with the emphasis on shared humanity and commonality across individuals, from which the human being emerges. Human nature is autonomous, rational, capable of free will, and unified in itself as an apex of existence. Posthumanism recognizes imperfectibility and disunity within oneself and understands the world through heterogeneous perspectives, very different kind of perspectives, and sometimes competing. Key to post-human practice is the ability to fluidly change perspectives and manifest oneself through different identities. And we all have to do that, like it or not. And post-human philosophy has an emergent ontology rather than a stable one. The post-human is not a singular, defined individual, but one who can become or embody different identities and understand the world from multiple heterogeneous perspectives. And that is the important focus of the transpositioning theory. So liquid modernity, from our point of view, is a trans era. And the trans era really is transcending, not just transferring in between, but transcending, going beyond multiple coexistences to create new communicative spaces, both physical and virtual, each with their own ecological specificities that shape meanings made within them. So meaning making with increased speed, rapidity, and that is very, very much the feature of today's communicative practices, complexity, and also reach across greater diversities of peoples and places. We can contact and communicate with individuals at the other, literally at the other end of the world instantly. And we do that all the time through social media and other digital mobile devices, and through much more expansive means and modes. So the way we communicate with each other, the way we maintain contact with each other expands all the time. We find new technologies and new methods, expansive modes and means. And the interweaving between communication, relationships, identities, and sense of belonging is again the key to our everyday life in the 21st century. That's where translanguaging comes in, a concept Kevin mentioned, and many of us in the audience here are very familiar with, so I won't spend too much time on it. I've been working on it from my own kind of perspective and interest. Translanguaging is really about multilingual language users drawing on their own personal and unique but unitary semiotic repertoires fluidly and seamlessly for communication. We draw on bits of all the semiotic resources we have access to in order to make meaning and make sense of the world. Specifically, translanguaging, the concept transcends not only the political and ideological boundaries of named languages, but also boundaries between linguistic and other semiotic means of communication, including multiple and different modalities. And that's something I know colleagues here in this room are also interested in. You may not be interested in multilingualism, but multimodalities definitely. For example, here is a shop sign. I think the shop is still there, but it's not as popular as it was 20 years ago. When I first saw it, I was puzzled by the sign and how to read the English part, the so-called English part of this. Because it actually is read as "it is time to play." But to play is not written out as such in the conventional sense, but with the icon on digital forms where you press it and then you play. And I thought that was really clever, and because it is actually a multimodal and multi-semantic sign. And this is where my late colleague and dear friend Gunter Kress always says, what makes a sign? That is definitely a sign. It's much more meaningful because of that multilingual and multi-semiotic combination that makes it much more meaningful, not just being more attractive. Of course, Hong Kong is a truly trans-languaging space. There are multiple languages, multiple signages, multiple modal resources that are really got together in that boundless kind of way for everyday communication. Everything is out there for people to see. We're working on some really interesting cognitive models. The sounds, we hear and the signs we see, how that impact on our way of processing information in everyday life. So, lots of different perspectives come into that, a new understanding of what multilingualism means to all of us. And of course, it's in the classroom. We're here, after all, in the Faculty of Education. We're concerned about learning. We're concerned about the education of young people. We're also concerned about teaching and the education of teachers. And we know in the classroom, it's a highly multilingual and multimodal space for us to practice in. So that leads to another related concept, which is transmodalities, not just translanguaging, but transmodalities. Translanguaging lends itself quite naturally to the idea of transmodalities that my friend Maggie Hawkins is working on especially. Transmodalities enables robust social semiotic analysis of communications interactions through the totality of signs, symbols, resources, modes, actors, and actants enmeshed in the communicative networks and ecologies within the socio-cultural, historical, geophysical, ideological, and material contexts in which they occur. Now, from translanguaging and transmodalities, we then come to the concept of transpositioning. Translanguaging and transmodalities are mechanisms enabling and facilitating transpositioning. And transpositioning is something that I'm really working on, and it's still a developing idea, but it's really about the breaking of boundaries and transforming relations and subjectivities. Transpositioning transcends the definition of positionings as constructed through exchanges in specific location-bound interactions, as well as potential for being seen as somewhat static and its tendency to be analyzed by single categorizations of identification, such as race, class, gender, and so on. To reference the full complexity, fluidity, entanglements, and contextualizations of ever-shifting positionings and positions, liberating us from notions of the space-bound, recognizing but also transcending the space and location. That's really important to understand the shifting of the change in between. It also transgresses external categorizations and boundaries. It references the relational nature of interactions and their fluidity, including the constant and ongoing assessment and confirmation or disconfirmation of relations, the construction of new ones, and the shifts and flows as they change, offering new possibilities of ethical engagement with others from an equity-based or equity-focused perspective, enacting critical cosmopolitanism that, again, Hawkins talks about. This in turn shapes meanings and understandings being constructed as the meanings reciprocally shape the interactions and relations. There are lots of abstract big concepts. Well, I'll break it down in a minute. Lots of this writing is also due to my collaborator TK, of course, here. Transpositioning is really, this is a key argument we want to present here. That is, transpositioning is absolutely necessary, it's a necessity, it's an essential skill to survive liquid modernity. Social conditions of transnationals and transculturals and all of us and translinguals and translingual movements like migration and encounters require the ability to transposition. And transposition is the process where individuals break from their preset or prescribed roles and switch perspectives with others. Empathy is really important too. Through communicative practices such as translanguaging and transmodalities, by releasing ourselves from conventions and fostering a greater sense of possibility, freeing ourselves from habitual thinking and building empathy with others involved in that process. Just a reminder of the features of liquid modernity from Bauman's writing. Nomadism becomes a general trait of the liquid modern person as they flow through their own life like a tourist, changing places, jobs, spouses, values, and sometimes more, such as political and sexual orientation, excluding themselves from traditional networks of support, while also freeing themselves from the restrictions and requirements of these networks impose. There is a lot of emphasis on self-identification. I'm going to give you a very quick account of Margaret Hawkins' work. I won't go into the detail. Lots of it is in that book. It's collaboratively written by her whole team. It's a UN award winning project. It's a global project, Global Story Bridges. And it has currently still expanding, but currently it has 16 different sites in 10 different countries where teenagers of poor background, low income background, under-resourced communities create digital stories. UN provides some free or very, very cheap digital devices like iPads freely provided to the teenagers. They will then create digital stories of their lives and their communities collectively and post them on a shared and dedicated website. So youth of similar age from other parts of the world or anybody really can watch and discuss, and then they exchange, and then they learn about the culture, about their ways of learning, different ways of learning, and also about their languages as well. The latter would then become the people who are watching these videos would then compose comments and comments collectively and post them on the same website, and the video makers in turn would discuss in groups and respond. So Hawkins talked about two different kind of positioning. One is spatial, which is really through digital means across, as I say, 16 different sites and in 10 different countries, but also relational positioning. So as a result of this online discussion, the relations and the responsibilities and identities of between these people really change, and change very vividly, visibly, and rapidly, even during the online discussion. And it's really, really interesting, some of those examples. So I urge colleagues here to read her studies in detail. Of course, it's a large global team. I'm now giving you an example from my own or our own work in complementary schools in England. These are kind of weekend language schools supporting British-born ethnic minority children to maintain their ethnic or home languages. So Chinese are very, very good at maintaining our own language schools all over the world. Everywhere there is a Chinese community, we have a Chinese school. As well as the shops and other services. We absolutely are passionate for the language education. We want our children, locally born children, to maintain the Chinese language. They're set up by ethnic minorities to support their British-born children to learn and maintain their home language. As I say, they take place over the weekend. The Chinese community is particularly good at this, and it's an international network as well. Apart from literacy classes, these schools often offer a range of cultural classes in history and society and arts. In the Chinese schools, it's typically Chinese painting, brush painting, and calligraphy, martial art, and some dancing as well, and other sports as well. I'm giving you a quick account of an episode that we observed in one of the classrooms in Manchester, where a young man in his late 20s from mainland China, as a teacher, acting out as a teacher in the weekend schools, he's a postgraduate student, teaching one of these so-called cultural classes, not the language bit. They actually really don't teach the language in that way. They teach the language through these cultural things. The topic of the lesson is the Chinese zodiac signs, because it was just coming to Chinese New Year. And the teacher was comparing Chinese science with the so-called European science, which was probably not the best kind of comparison because they were not really linked in that way. Now, the classroom was equipped with interactive whiteboard and traditional writing board in green on the wall in front of the class. The teacher and all the students have iPads, and that's very typical of modern classes, and certainly in England, especially these complementary schools for ethnic minorities, they're very well equipped. Individuals are very well equipped, either iPads or laptop computers in front of each and every child. On this occasion, the interactive whiteboard was showing the 12 Chinese animal signs, and there's some handwritten chalk text in a mixture of Chinese and English by the teacher on the green board. And the teacher was holding his own iPad synchronized with the interactive whiteboard, and it has text and pictures that explains the signs. I don't have the actual picture to show you, or I'm not supposed to be showing pictures of the kids, but essentially the teacher was standing in front of the class, even though he was holding his own iPad, and the kids typically, as in most schools in England, they sit around round tables. They're not kind of sitting like this, or in the typical Chinese classrooms, very much front-facing and teacher-centered. They're kind of group work. Each of them would have laptops and iPads. The arrows indicate the physical movement of the teacher. And that's what I'm interested in this particular episode, the spatial transpositioning, literally changing the physical position of the teacher. And I'm here more interested in the teacher's transpositioning and its implications for teacher education. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then went back to where he was. And what then happened was, once he moved physically to one of the pupils, I'll explain the details in a minute, his perspective then changed. He was looking at the screen of one of the pupils' own laptop. So he was looking at from a very different perspective, and his physical and spatial transpositioning then led to what Margaret Hawkins talked about as relational transpositioning, because now he is part of the learning community as the teacher, as the pupils, equal partner in co-learning, and a concept I'm going to develop in a minute. This is not actually that class, but you see this actually really, really often. Perhaps not in East Asia context, because teachers tend not to move physically so much, partly because of the space of the classroom, and partly because there's just so many kids in typical classes. The pupils in this class are between 12 and 14-year-old, mostly Chinese only parentage. There are usually 3 mixed race pupils in this particular class, but on this occasion, only one girl whose mother is Chinese and father half Indian, half Caucasian was present. And the girl was born in Hong Kong, but returned in her own words. It's all very interesting, the discourses they adapt in terms of their identity to Britain when she was little. Her friends nicknamed her India. I mean, you can say, well, that's a bit dodgy, but actually she loved that name. And India can be an actual name for girls. She not only doesn't mind, but actually seems to like it a lot. She tells us that she has been called India, since she was very little, and even her family calls her that. So from the field notes, it wasn't completely video recorded, but we had some video and also audio recording. The teacher displays the 12 Chinese animal signs and 12 European zodiac signs on the interactive whiteboard, talking about Chinese signs as earthly creatures, animals. So there's the actual text. You can see the trans-languaging practices, mixing Chinese and English there, and some really interesting kind of use of languages. I won't go into details. Trying to find the monthly dates for each of the European signs on his laptop. He wasn't just showing the text on the interaction whiteboard. He was literally using the iPad as part of the teaching and trying to find information as well. Turns to the interaction whiteboard to show pointing, touching. Very multimodal, very typical teaching. In our teaching, it's very much embodied and multimodal, and this is nothing new or different from us. And then he started naming the various tourists and whatever, and then he mispronounces some of these terms because this is, I guess, somewhat new to him, and sometimes he gets into a slightly odd pronunciation. One of the boys in the class just corrected him, gave him the right pronunciation as it were, and he gets a bit of information and learns from the pupils as well. And sometimes he actually asks the pupils, "How do you call this?" Because he doesn't know, he's not sure about this pronunciation. How do you pronounce it? Pointing to the sign on the interactive whiteboard, and several students would pronounce it out, and he would repeat. And it's very interesting that when that kind of thing happens a number of times, and he continues to the end. And this is very typical of what we call co-learning. And I'll talk about the theory in a minute, but this is the actual practice, what co-learning is about. So the teacher is also learning from the students. Then he turns to India and say, "India, can you explain?" India said, "What? Explain what?" "Well, do you know what they mean?" And India paused and thought, "Why are you asking me to do that?" I guess well, we did ask the teacher, "Why did you ask India to do this?" And he said, "Well, she's kind of half European. She's only a quarter European, and probably know this better, but she actually didn't, but she was also looking at something quite different. So she paused and said, "Well, they're just animals like the Chinese." And some other kids just laughed, and the teacher actually said, "No, they're not animals." And then she tried to explain other signs because she was looking at a different website on her own laptop, which was about the Indian zodiac system. That's when the teacher actually walked over to her, because the teacher didn't know what India was talking about. So that's when he moved over, turned to her computer screen, looked at the signs, and asked, "Are the Indian signs?" And the teachers asked that, and India wasn't sure. What, yeah, with a bit of hesitation. And the teacher said, "Are they different?" And he said, "I think so." And basically flips to an image and asks, in the same sign, there are more. Basically, there are more signs. Whether they're animals or not, she wasn't sure. And then the teacher kind of looked at it and went back to the front of the class. This is the kind of sign she was looking at, the Indian zodiac signs, which has a lot more terms and animals and others. So you can see there's new information, very different perspective. The teacher had to, deal with this. So you use the same size or not? The teacher asked India. India says, "I think so, but hey, I'm not sure about all this. There are cultural identity issues that are really complex, and it needs a little chapter to really analyze all the details there. But there are more, and they're not signs, not like the main signs. They're stars, I think," India says. And one of the girls looked at her own laptop, says, "Oh, it says here," pointing to her own screen, "there are 27 divisions or sections, or 28. Again, they're working it out. And it's not some information that the teacher actually had. The teacher didn't know that. And this whole thing continued in a very interesting way. So the pupils were active contributors to knowledge and working out what they're learning. So they're really part and parcel of this learning process. So again, there are other bits of the discourse, the exchange, which you can analyze it from a purely linguistic point of view, from a code switching point of view, from any other perspective. But here, my interest is really the content of it and the ways of learning. What we've seen is very simple, but actually deeply, well, I say simple, it's really, really complex example of spatial and relational transpositioning. The classroom flow is at a different level. It flows very naturally. There is nobody who's thinking, oh, this is chaos. This is like, it's just nobody commented, meta commented on the process because it's very natural. But the use of the spatial repertoire, the physical movement, really transpositioned the teachers and the pupils' relationship. Yeah. Now the teacher and the pupils are co-learners in this context. They're no longer teacher and pupil in that kind of asymmetrical power relationship, but as co-constructors of knowledge as a result of physical and spatial transpositioning. So led to a new relational kind of transpositioning. The idea of co-learning was very much inspired by the work of Edward Brandmeier, where he talked about pedagogy of vulnerability. It's very much in terms of teacher education. In the classroom context, co-learning changes the role sets of teachers and learners from dispensers and receptacles of knowledge to joint sojourners on the quest for knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. The teacher would become a learning facilitator, a scaffolder, a critical reflection enhancer, while the learner becomes an empowered explorer, a meaning maker, and responsible knowledge constructor. And these are really, really interesting kind of changed positions and changing concept. The characteristics of a co-learning classroom environment involve shared power amongst co-learners, social and individualized learning. The emphasis is very much on individualized or personalized learning, but at the same time, collective and individual meaning making and identity exploration. We give space and time to individuals' exploration, but we do this collectively together in the classroom. So you have this shared community of practice with situated learning and with real world engagement and action. So it's not about some abstract knowledge. Even when we are dealing with abstract knowledge, we bring the real world into the discussion and we use connections with the real world and lived experiences to enhance that learning. So it's about situated learning, but bringing in the real world into the classroom. And co-learning entails admitting on behalf of the teacher that one does not know everything. And the teacher has to be human and take certain risks. So that's why Brandmeier talks about pedagogy of vulnerability, the risk of self-disclosure. When he doesn't know the pronunciation of a particular term and invites the pupils to teach him, that is a big risk to take. And risk of change, risk of not knowing, and risk of failing as well. But co-learning and transpositioning really go together. As the example shows, spatial transpositioning can lead to relational transpositioning, becoming co-learners in this context as a result of the physical movement, even though it was just a short and brief movement. The teacher realized diversity of science, initially wanted to ask India about European science to highlight her causation side, but then realized actually there are other systems as well. There are other cultural systems with different size. So it transcends place, race, gender, age, social status, professional-based positionings, all in one short example. You can analyze that at very different and multiple levels, resulting in translanguaging shifts that translanguaging scholars have been talking about, where learning actually happens. So the whole point about translanguaging as a pedagogical philosophy is to trigger translanguaging shifts. Learning actually happens when your positions and perspectives change. Teachers have a lot to learn by viewing the pupils from their own lived experiences, from their own positionings, and not from that of the state or the school or the teacher's own positionings. There, his initial assumption, this is a partially a causation child must understand the European science, actually led to something quite unexpected from his point of view. They need to design pedagogy by turning the classroom into transformative translanguaging spaces to facilitate their students' personal translanguaging journeys, to assemble pieces of their lives, cultures, and language in creative wholes, and to ensure that all students' languaging lives are included in school, and to transform the ways they view each other's languaging practices and experiences as well. I won't have time to give you the very latest scholarship from Kevin's own work. I'm sure you will want to read the example. The second example in this forthcoming paper, in-press paper, is particularly interesting. It's actually about exactly what transpositioning is all about. So the teacher there is adopting different positionings in constructing imaginary scenarios in the secondary maths classroom. So the teacher then talks about him being a hiker, and it's a really interesting example. I wish I had time to go into this, but you can read his article there. Now, the need for transpositioning is much more enhanced in the digital age. So I'm moving slightly out of the learning context. We all know the real cultural revolution is happening right now because of the digital media. And this is, old statistics from China, mainland China, that is. The actual engagement with digital devices is experienced not just by young people, but by people of all ages and generations. And some people literally live their entire life on digital media with digital devices. They wake up, first thing they do is check their WeChat messages and WhatsApp or whatever. And of course, the last thing they do before they go to sleep is again, checking their mobile devices. Now, only creative transposition is possible, either interlingual transposition from one poetic shape into another. Sorry, this is Roman Jakobsen's quote from many decades ago, when he was already talking about the ideas of transpositioning. And he remarked on only creative transpositioning is possible, either translingual transposition from one poetic shape into another, or interlingual transposition from one language into another, or finally intersemiotic transposition from one system of science into another, like from verbal art into music, dance, cinema, or painting. This is about this kind of really interesting intermediate and intersemiotic translation, translanguaging. Again, T.K. Li here has written extensively about that on translanguaging and translation. But the important thing here, the point here is the shift emphasis, well, basically it shifts the emphasis from form or function mapping to meaning making in life and as living. So the ing form is equally important in all of this process. So Jakobsen wasn't talking about transpositioning, but transposition. We want to add the ing there to emphasize as it happens, but also as living. And I should say there are lots of other colleagues are now getting into the languaging and transpositioning work. Bill Cope and Mary Calantis, I'm sure, whose work is very well known to this audience, have been talking about transpositional grammar, looking at literacy, but also multimodality, multiliteracy and digital literacy. So revisiting, I mean, all this work revisits basic concepts like literacy, multiliteracy, social literacy, digital literacy, and really fundamentally questioning the notions of learning or reconceptualizing learning and communication as well. And we see the digital devices, digital means have really given new affordances to translanguaging, transcripting, and transmoding spaces. Again, you see this in our everyday life. We're also familiar with that. In the digital world, social media users are no longer passive receivers of information, but active producers of knowledge. And we actually need to acknowledge that and remind ourselves we're contributing to the collective contribution, construction of knowledge on this grand scale, a global scale. We may not feel it, but every time we make a comment or even press like or send an emoji onto social media, we're contributing to the construction of knowledge in this world. Learning, communicating is digital and is multimodal, and that needs to be acknowledged in schools, in the classroom. The real challenge is on the teachers and teacher education. How do we integrate the real learning that is happening there in the digital world and multimodally into the formal side of learning? At the same time, we all take on multiple roles, have multiple relationships and responsibilities. This is where I started off today. And that's something that really is of concern. How do we deal with this multiplexity and simultaneous holding of different roles and responsibilities and relationships? And transpositioning, I guess, as a concept really is about that. So in terms of conclusion, 21st century characteristics: rapid, constant changes, multiple roles, relationships, and responsibilities, fluid identities and subjectivities really urge us to develop a truly transpositioning capacity or capacity for transpositioning. Ability for transpositioning is absolutely key to basic survival, let alone success. If you want to be successful in the postmodern 21st century, you absolutely have to have the capacity to transposition, not just in terms of communication, but really dealing with complex networks of relationships. Communication is translingual and transmodal. Educational futures absolutely need to focus on developing transpositioning capacities in ourselves, in our students, as well as all the people that learning impacts on through practices like co-learning, translanguaging, and transmodalities. Now, in this sense, we actually, I'm really, really pleased to see some of the documents that have emerged in the celebration of your 40th anniversary. We really have a shared vision between the two institutions. You are number one globally in the latest US news ranking, and we've been lucky enough to be number one in the QS ranking for education for the last 11 years. Yes, and we also have a shared future, absolutely. Despite our physical distance, we absolutely have that shared future. I also really want to highlight our shared broad, multi, inter, and transdisciplinary approaches to education. So both of our faculties have that really quite unique sense that education needs to be taken in the broadest possible way. And you have that multi, inter, and transdisciplinary base to do education research, and that's really important. At the same time, we remain true to our origin. We didn't forget choosing, the original intention with teacher education at the heart. So, but we all face real challenges as teachers face, like AI, new digital technologies. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is, we have to also develop a transpositioning capacities in our trainee teachers with all these challenges in mind. Children come to school with very different ways of learning and acquiring knowledge from our generations. So we have to really pay more attention on how children these days learn. We are battling with how to teach literacy to children in English schools because literally parents say, well, I can't teach my child to spell because they just don't want to learn spelling. There is no point. And if you ask a child, why don't you, learn the spelling rules properly, whether through phonics or not, is another debate I don't want to go into. But kids would say, well, if I don't know how to spell, I speak to my phone spell it out for me. I never need to learn how to spell. I type out some initial sounds. My computer just does it for me. So, how do we deal with that? It's a very practical question. There is a lot of catching up and co-learning required on behalf of the teachers, not the children. So we are behind the children's learning, and we need to understand how they learn and actually adapt that in the classroom, including teacher education. For far too long, we believe schools can mold young people in certain ways. Schools absolutely do that, but not always successfully or not in the way that is most appropriate or effective for the contemporary world, let alone for future world. So expectations of liquid modernity, change is the only constant. And education for social change entails developing transpositioning capacities for the 21st century. And teacher education needs to reposition the teacher as co-learners and knowledge as fluid. Thank you very much.